In this episode, we take a security step that is easy to underestimate when people get excited about AI features. We lock down the endpoints that make those features reachable. An endpoint is the place where requests come in and responses go out, and it is often the most visible part of the AI system to an attacker. If an endpoint is exposed broadly, attackers can probe it, flood it, scrape it, and search for misconfigurations, even if the model behind it is well-behaved most of the time. Locking down endpoints is about building a strong perimeter around the service boundary and then hardening the service itself so it behaves predictably under stress. The three phrases in the title are important because they work together. Network controls determine who can reach the endpoint at all. Segmentation determines what the endpoint can reach if it is compromised. Service hardening reduces the number of ways the endpoint can be broken or misused. For beginners, a helpful mental model is that an endpoint is a door to a building. You want a good lock on the door, but you also want the building's internal rooms separated, and you want the door frame and hinges reinforced so the door cannot simply be kicked in. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at Cyber.Me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. Network controls are the first line of defense because the safest request is the request that never reaches the service. Network controls include rules that allow or deny traffic based on origin, destination, protocol, and sometimes identity. For an AI endpoint, network controls might mean that only your application servers can call the model service, and no user device can call it directly. It might mean that only certain internal networks can reach the endpoint, or that the endpoint is not internet-facing at all. If the endpoint must be reachable from the internet, network controls can still reduce risk by using protective gateways that absorb scanning and enforce basic rules before traffic hits the service. Beginners often hear phrases like internal only and assume the job is done, but internal networks are not magical safe zones. Machines get compromised, users bring infected devices, and attackers look for any path inward. Network controls are about narrowing the set of possible callers so a compromise in one place does not automatically become access from everywhere. If you can reduce exposure from millions of potential callers to a handful of trusted services, you have dramatically reduced your attack surface. A strong network posture also includes controlling how requests enter the environment, which often means using a gateway layer that terminates connections, enforces limits, and provides a single place to apply consistent protections. Even without naming specific products, the concept is that you want a controlled choke point that can enforce authentication, rate limits, and basic input constraints at the edge. This is useful because the model service itself may not be designed to handle raw internet traffic safely, especially under abusive conditions. Gateways can also provide better observability, such as seeing unusual request patterns or scanning attempts, which helps detection. Another important network control is encryption in transit, meaning that traffic between clients, gateways, and services is protected against interception. While encryption does not stop an attacker from sending malicious requests, it prevents eavesdropping and credential theft on the wire. For beginners, the main idea is that network controls are about denying unnecessary paths, monitoring allowed paths, and protecting traffic along those paths. Segmentation is the next idea, and it is a way of limiting damage if the endpoint is compromised or misused. Segmentation means dividing your environment into zones with controlled communication between them, so one service does not automatically have access to everything. In AI deployments, segmentation is particularly important because the model service often sits near sensitive data flows. If the endpoint service can reach internal databases, file shares, or admin interfaces, then a compromise of that endpoint could become a stepping stone into the deeper environment. Segmentation aims to prevent that. For example, the model service might be placed in a zone where it can only talk to a limited set of supporting services, like a retrieval service that enforces authorization and a logging service with restricted access. It would not be able to reach unrelated internal systems, and it would not be able to initiate outbound connections to the internet unless required. Beginners sometimes think segmentation is only for large enterprises, but it is a universal principle. Do not let one service be a bridge to everything else. When you segment, you create containment, and containment is what keeps incidents from becoming catastrophes. Segmentation also applies to data access pathways, because data is often the most valuable asset in an AI system. If the model endpoint can directly query a data store, and that data store contains sensitive information, then the endpoint becomes a high-value target. A more secure design routes data access through services that implement strong authorization and auditing, and then places network rules so the endpoint can only talk to those services, not directly to databases. This design makes it harder for an attacker to use the endpoint as a data exfiltration tool. It also makes it easier to control and monitor data access centrally. Another segmentation concept is separating environments, such as development, testing, and production, so that experimental endpoints cannot reach production data or production tools. This matters because development endpoints often have weaker controls and more debug features, which attackers love. A beginner takeaway is that segmentation is about enforcing the principle that not every door leads to every room. Service hardening is the third part of the title, and it focuses on making the endpoint service itself more resistant to attack and misuse. Hardening starts with reducing what the service exposes. You disable unnecessary features, remove unused routes, and avoid running extra components in the same process that could be exploited. You also enforce strong authentication and authorization at the service boundary, even if network controls are strong, because defense in depth matters. Hardening includes setting strict input limits, validating content types, and rejecting malformed requests early, because malformed requests are often how vulnerabilities are triggered. It also includes safe error handling, so the service does not reveal internal details through verbose errors that help attackers learn. Beginners sometimes treat error messages as harmless, but in security, error details can be like a map. Hardening aims to make the service boring from the attacker's perspective. Fewer clues, fewer features, fewer weak points. Hardening also includes protecting secrets and configuration, because endpoint services often hold credentials needed to call other services. If those secrets are stored poorly, exposed in logs, or accessible to too many processes, an attacker who compromises the endpoint can steal them and move laterally. Secure hardening practices include minimizing secrets available to the endpoint, using short-lived credentials where possible, and restricting what the endpoint can do even with those credentials. Hardening also means keeping dependencies updated and tracking vulnerabilities, because endpoint services often rely on web frameworks, parsing libraries, and serialization code that can have known weaknesses. For AI, this matters because services may accept complex payloads, such as file uploads or structured tool call data, which can trigger vulnerabilities if parsing is weak. A beginner-friendly framing is that the endpoint service should be treated like any other internet-facing service. Patch it, minimize it, and assume it will be attacked. Observability is closely linked to hardening because you need to see what the endpoint is doing in order to defend it. Locking down endpoints is not only blocking traffic, it is also detecting when someone is testing the locks. That includes monitoring request rates, unusual request patterns, repeated authorization failures, and spikes in error codes. In AI systems, it can also include monitoring token usage patterns, because an attacker might use large requests to exhaust resources. Endpoint logs should capture enough metadata to support investigation without storing sensitive prompt content broadly. This is a balance, and the balance is achieved through careful logging design and restricted access to logs. Monitoring also supports segmentation, because if you see an endpoint attempting to connect to forbidden internal addresses, that can signal compromise or misconfiguration. Beginners should recognize that good monitoring is not optional. It is what turns your controls into an active defense rather than passive hope. A special concern for AI endpoints is that they can be attractive targets for scraping and extraction attempts, even if the attacker is not trying to break in. An attacker might repeatedly query the endpoint to replicate its behavior or to collect outputs that have value. Network controls, rate limits, and authentication policies all contribute to reducing this risk, but endpoint hardening also includes making sure the endpoint does not reveal more than necessary. For example, returning overly detailed metadata about the model, version, or internal policies can help attackers tune their probing. Likewise, returning overly verbose error responses can teach an attacker how your validation works. A secure endpoint provides minimal necessary information to legitimate clients and avoids being chatty with unauthenticated or suspicious callers. The goal is not to rely on secrecy, but to avoid giving away unnecessary details that increase attacker efficiency. As we close, locking down endpoints is about shaping reachability and limiting blast radius. Network controls shrink who can even knock on the door and protect traffic in transit. Segmentation limits what can happen if the door is forced or if a legitimate caller is compromised, preventing the endpoint from becoming a bridge into everything else. Service hardening reduces the endpoint's weaknesses by minimizing features, enforcing strict validation, protecting secrets, and handling errors safely. When you combine these, you create a strong boundary around your AI services that supports everything else we have discussed, from guardrails to toolchain security. The main beginner lesson is that endpoints are where the world touches your system, and the world is not always friendly. If you treat endpoint security as foundational rather than optional, you make it much harder for attackers to probe, overload, or compromise your AI capabilities, and you make it much easier to operate those capabilities safely as they grow.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.